Well, hello there. And I have a slightly different background. Yep, this is the lecture for lecture. But I'm at the lab room because when it comes to the bones, there are these ridiculous PowerPoints. You can work through the chapter. I just want you to know your bones. And a lot of the chapter is very specific in terms of regions on the bone, and we don't need a lot of that. So I'm using the bones to show you the bones, and hopefully you can come to the lab and learn them yourself. So I'm here. It is 61 degrees inside the room. It's warmer outside, which is why I'm in a jacket and a long sleeve shirt and lots of clothes. So if I start shivering, you know why. So I got a couple support bones to help me with this lecture, which is why I wanted to do it this way instead of just pointing on a piece of paper, because it's more interesting and it's easier for me. So I think I'm just going to get started. You already did chapter 8 on bone tissue, so we also talked about different classes of bones. I know, this is going to be weird. I'm up, I'm down, I'm all around. It's going to be one of those lectures. We have flat bones, right? Which we're going to talk about. These are flat bones. And flat bones, this is actually the sternum on, I'll just use my buddy here. Okay, come on over, friend. Smile, you're on camera. Yeah, you're a movie star. Flat bones, and flat bones like the ribs, the flat bones like the sternum. We have long bones. We'll talk about this. This is the humerus, radius of ulna. We have short bones like the carpals, the wrist bones. We have irregular bones. Regular bones like the vertebrae in the back, and I can believe even the mandible on the skull and pelvis. Can you get in there? No. Flat, long, short, irregular, and then they throw, this is his leg, and this is the kneecap, and the kneecap's the patella. That's a sesamoid bone, and that is also in a short bone category, but it can be its own. All right, when we look at the skeleton, we have the axial skeleton. It's like the body axis. So it's going to be the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. Tilt this a little bit. So that's one part, and that's what this first lecture is. This is going to be on the axial skeleton. So we're going to run through the bones of the skull, the parts of the sternum, the ribs, the different categories of ribs, the different vertebrae, and then the sacrum and the coccyx. That is today's lecture, or this lecture. I'm actually doing both today. So that's the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton are the appendages, and those bones that are needed to hold it onto the body's torso. So I will have the arms and the legs as part, all the way down to the feet, as part of the appendicular skeleton, but then I will also have what you guys call the clavicle and scapula, collarbone and shoulder blade. That's the girdle that holds the arm, pectoral girdle holding the upper arm limbs, and then you'll have the pelvis, right, the pelvic girdle, holding the legs onto the torso. So a lot of people think the pelvis is part of the axial skeleton. It's not. It's appendicular. All right. So having said that, we're going to dive right in because there's a lot that you're responsible for with the skull. This is another friend. Okay. I'm going to sit down for this so that I can make sure I show you all the good parts. Hello. I am Mr. Skeleton. Now, I'm hoping you guys can see colors. Can you see the sutures? Nope, not really. My webcam, I guess. Oh, they're kind of showing now. Okay. All right, so hold it back a little bit. This is the skeleton, the skull. If you're able to kind of lift the lid off of these, you'll see that in lab. If you're able to come to campus, oops, and of course the mandible is floating all over the place. Put the jaw where it's supposed to be. Okay. All right. So let's start with some bones. You have bones, and then you have these lines. Oops, can't really do it. This line, there's a line here, there's a line here. As I step away, there's a line across the back, and there's, can you see it? A line across the side. These lines are joints. They're fibrous joints, and they're called sutures, and you need to know 4 of the sutures of the skull and the bones that they connect. So I wanted to just kind of get an overview. We have eye sockets, eye orbitals, the nasal socket cavity, and obviously jaw. And then on the underside, there's a big hole in the middle. Hopefully you know what that's for. That's for the spinal cord, and I'm going to give you the fancy names. I'm not going to be writing them down. There's a list of bones you need to know on this lecture portion, so you can have that maybe printed out or have it separate. So this hole, it's a big hole, and that's its name, but its name is big hole in Latin, so it's magnum foramen. Foramen magnum, hole big. So foramen, hole, magnum, big. So foramen magnum is the big hole on the bottom. All right, so when we're looking at the skeleton, trying to hold it so you guys can see it. That's good. You've got the big, the skull bone right in the front. That is the frontal. You have 2 on each side with this suture running down the middle. These are both parietal. You'll have the bone in the back. That is occipital, right? So occipital, parietal, frontal, another parietal. Oh, parietal's on this big side. Now, if you look on the side, you will see where the ear hole is. And this bone here is a temporal bone. So the temporal bone has where sound will enter in to get into the brain. All right, so parietal's on the side, temporal's down below, occipital's in the back, frontal is in the front. So far, so good. We have these 2 little bones on the bridge of your nose. They are your nasal bone. Inside the skull, on both sides, see that little hole there? That little hole is for tears to drain from your eyeball into your nose. And that's a duct. That's the lacrimal duct. So this bone in here is the lacrimal bone. So I have nasal bone, I have lacrimal bone. I have the vomer, this bony ridge on the underside of your nose. This is the maxilla. This is the mandible, all right, your lower jaw. So let's look at this again, right? Here's your ear hole. That's your temporal bone. It's your mandible. Where these 2 come together, that's the temporomandibular joint. If some of you have lockjaw, it's called TMJ. Temporal mandibular joint is where they come together. There is a couple bones on the inside. So, oh, hang on. You got your cheekbone. Your cheekbone is your zygomatic bone, right? Those big sexy cheeks on not me. That's your zygomatic, and your zygomatic will join up with your temporal bone. So we have frontal, parietal on both sides, temporal down below, occipital, zygomatic, nasal, lacrimal for crying, maxilla, mandible. All right. Are we ready to open your head up so we can talk about some other bones that make up the eye socket? You know, I don't even have my sheet of the bones. I should have brought it to make sure I talk about everything I'm supposed to. I'm pretty comfortable with this. This is the inside. Now, I don't know if you can see there's yellow. And there's this little nook. Can you see it from that angle? there's this little nook inside your skull. This little nook that my finger's in, that's where your pituitary gland sits. That's called the sella turcica. And there's a butterfly bone that contains that little nook, and that's the sphenoid bone. I have sphenoid, and then up front more. Oh, that's not, so kind of that butterfly shape, that's the sphenoid. The sella turcica is in the middle. And then as I go more toward the front, more anterior, I have the ethmoid bone. So I have sphenoid, ethmoid, frontal. Those are all bones that help make up the eye socket. Those are all bones that have sinuses. Sinuses are little holes, little cavities filled with mucous membrane to trap bacteria, to lighten the skull, have more air. So when you have a sinus headache, right, you rub your forehead, you rub all the parts around your eyes, and that's because of the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, oh, and the maxilla. I'm like, there's a fourth because I don't have my sheet. The maxilla also has sinuses in it for lightening the skull. Okay, those are my bones. I'm going to put this baby back together. Now, I don't know if you remember chapter 1. It was a bit of a blur, but we talked about suture. We talked about sections, right? And I said, oh, well, you can call this a frontal section. Hey, this is the frontal bone. You can call this a coronal section, cutting you into a front and back, because this suture is the coronal suture. So the coronal suture joins the frontal and the two parietal. The sagittal suture, running up the top of your skull, running up here for the left and the right, connects the two parietal bones together. So I had coronal, I have sagittal. All right, so coronal, sagittal on the front. If we go to the side, we got this side guy. The side guy is a squamous suture connecting parietal and temporal. Your temporal bone, your parietal bone, there's a joint, a suture, and that is the squamous suture. And we have one last one I want you to know. Can we see it? Oh, there it comes into focus. And that's the guy lining the back. Okay, so there's also a suture along the back of your skull, and that is connecting the occipital bone, because occipital is at the base of the back of your skull. So it's the occipital bone and the two parietal. So parietal, occipital, lambdoid suture connecting the two. I'm trying to get that. I guess that's a little better. So this one running up the middle, connecting the two parietal, is the other side of the sagittal suture. Sagittal, lambdoid, squamous, and then up the front, where are you, buddy? There, coronal, with the frontal and the parietal. All right, foramen magnum, big hole in the back. I even showed you where your pituitary gland likes to sit. Before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about sutures. And for that, I need this little guy here, right? So this little guy is representing a fetal skull. These are all artificial. So I'm not really holding a little baby's head, if for those of you that are uncomfortable. And you have sutures in your skull, so the skull can grow. But But when you're an infant or when you're a fetus and you're about to be born, your skull bones need to slide over each other. So you need things not solid yet, because I think even though I believe this is a male, he can still demonstrate nicely. If I can move the chair. I'm going to be all over the place today. You're just going to be like, this is wonderful, Laura. Okay, so we're actually looking at the pelvis, and we're going to talk about that more in the other lecture. So if you're pregnant, right, the baby's being carried in the front, but when the baby's born, it's got to go through this outlet in the pelvis and get squeezed out the other side, out the uterus. So I have to have all these skull bones slide over each other, and what it leaves me with are soft spots, fontanelles in the infant skeleton, right? There's a big one up the front, And there's also one in the back, a more minor fontanelle. So those go away as the skull starts to kind of not need to slide over each other anymore. And they become fibrous joints. So they just have like fibrous tissue connecting your skull bones, and then totally ossified, totally made into bone when you're an adult, because you're all done growing. And I think I stopped growing young, and I have a freakishly tiny head, but this guy's got a good size head. So, you know, and in an adult skull, these will all be solid bone, ossified sutures. Okay, so that's my skull. I feel kind of bad because I probably should have gotten my sheet. So let's work our way down. We're leaving the skull here, and now we're going to look at the vertebrae. And I think I already had you guys watch this other guy, but we have the vertebrae running down the length, and then at the very bottom is the sacrum, and then I have, can you see at the very bottom, the tailbone? That's the coccyx. So sacrum and coccyx. And I'm pretty sure I have an artificial one right here. So this is it a little closer, right? That's the sacrum. It's a 5 fused vertebrae, and the coccyx is about 3 fused vertebrae. So they're fused together, and we'll be revisiting the sacrum actually in the second lecture. But now I have all of the vertebrae. So I have cervical vertebrae associated with not the thoracic cavity. I have thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae. So 3 different regions: cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. And when you think about this, it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So 7, breakfast for me is at 7, 12, and 5. That's how many vertebrae you have of the different regions. So 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, right? You have lumbar support, that's the lower back. So hopefully that helps you remember lumbar vertebrae down below. Thoracic is associated with all the ribs in the thoracic cage, and cervical is above it, superior to it. So when we look at these vertebrae, let's still just visit the vertebrae itself. Somebody just texted me. Okay, they look very different. This is, I'm going to spin it around for you. This is a thoracic vertebrae. I'm holding the body. I'm going to squat down instead of moving the thing. And in this one hand here, that's a thoracic vertebrae. Smaller body, a whole lot of pointy edges. This is a lumbar vertebrae. Very clunky. Look at this body. This centrum is just clunky. Chunky, clunky. Bones that are chunky and clunky are weight-bearing. Bones that have a lot of pointy things mean that they articulate. They join up with other bones. So in the thoracic cavity, I'm articulating with ribs, so I have more pointy stuff. I'm not going to be as weight-bearing as a lumbar vertebra. So lumbar, clunky, chunky, thoracic, a little more refined. And then we get to the cervical vertebrae. And cervical vertebrae are a lot daintier. So what I want to show you is, this is C1. Your whole head is being held in place by C1 vertebra. It goes on a little pedestal there, and it's being held up. So because C1 vertebra holds your skull, this is known as the atlas, right? Because atlas is holding the weight of the world. And C1 vertebra, atlas, is holding up the skull on these little processes. Now, C2 is called the axis. And this, you guys, a bunch of kookalukas, let's see. This is C2. And C2's got this nubbin sticking out of it. That nubbin is called the dens. And, let me put it the right way. What happens is, so I have atlas, C1, axis, C2, and this nubbin kind of holds them in together, and this allows you to say, When you are spinning your head, no, that is actually your atlas and your axis spinning on each other based on this. If I hold it in front of dark stuff, you can see it. This dens, this protruding part of the bone is called the dens, and that's how it slides around. So we are going to be talking about joints, and one of them is a pivot joint where they rotate on each other, and C1, C2 is a very good example of a pivot joint. So, and when you come to lab, you will be able to see this better. Okay, so that is cervical vertebrae. I have 7 because I eat breakfast at 7 o'clock. 12 for thoracic vertebrae. 5 for lumbar vertebrae. The next thing I want to talk about are curvatures that we see in the vertebrae. We have primary curvatures, secondary curvatures, and abnormal curvatures. All right, so I feel like I should be writing this on a board, but there's no board behind me. Well, we'll get to it. All right, primary curvatures are curvatures that you are born with. So when we look at the vertebrae, there's four options, I guess. 4 regions that are going to either be a primary curvature or a secondary curvature. So we have the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, and the sacral region. So primary curvatures are those parts that kind of you can see when you're looking at the skeleton when you think, okay, babies are curled up into a ball. So these curvatures that are going out are primary, meaning you're born with them. So you are born with the thoracic curvature because you know you're curled into a ball. And then the sacral curvature is also primary. You're born with it. The other 2 curvatures, the one we see in the cervical area and the one we see in the lumbar area, are secondary curvatures. They arise after birth. So, okay, why do these develop at all? Well, what's the first thing a baby's going to do? First thing a baby's going to do is hold up its head. So in order to hold up its head, it has to develop this secondary curvature in the cervical vertebrae. The next thing that the baby's going to do is learn how to walk by 1, right? I mean, these babies do so much in the first year. So a lumbar curvature is also a secondary curvature because it happens after birth. So, okay. Kind of have a piece of paper. Well, I don't kind of. I do have a piece of paper. So let's write primary curvature, secondary curvature. Primary curvature, cervical. No, it's not. Thoracic. Oh my gosh. And primary curvature was sacral. Ding-a-ling. Secondary curvature, meaning it comes after birth, holding up the head, so cervical, and learning how to walk, so lumbar. Great. I wrote that on a piece of paper. Maybe you can see it. Oh, I guess you can't really see it. Okay, forget it. I won't write on paper again. Unfortunately, you'll have to go to the lecture notes or the textbooks for the abnormal curvatures and how to spell them. But there's 3 abnormal curvatures, and probably most girls are like me and grew up being petrified of the crooked spine, right? So scoliosis is one abnormal curvature of the spine, and that's where your spine is like an S shape. So it's abnormal left to right, there's a curvature. Another abnormal curvature is the hunchback. Right? My little Aunt Carol walks around like this. Oh, hi, Laura. You know, she hunches over. And she has a horrific humpback. And that is an abnormal curvature of the cervical and probably upper thoracic vertebrae. And that is known as kyphosis. I'm blanking out on that. So kyphosis is the abnormal curvature of the upper vertebrae. Scoliosis, abnormal S-shaped curvature left to right. And then the other curvature we have that's abnormal is down in the lumbar area, and it's a real accentuated like sway back. So it's kind of more so with pregnant women because they're offset their center of gravity and they're kind of swaying back, and that's called lordosis. So I always think of it, oh lordy, I hate being pregnant. Lordosis down in the lumbar area. Kyphosis, even though it begins with a K, up in the cervical, upper thoracic area, and then scoliosis, the S-shaped one, through the probably thoracic and lumbar region. Right, so those are my abnormal curvatures. I have primary curvature, I'm born with, thoracic and sacral. Secondary curvature, after birth, they develop cervical and lumbar, and then the abnormals. Kyphosis, scoliosis, lordosis. Okay, we are cooking with gas. So I'm going to spin it around now and talk about the front area of this beautiful skeleton. And this is my thoracic cage, and it is made up of ribs and the sternum. So when we're looking at the sternum, here's a closer up look. The sternum actually has 3 regions. Maybe you can see it better on this guy. I don't want to get him too close because I have it tangled. Alrighty, I guess we can see. Guess you don't need to listen to me hum. Let me raise it up a little. I'm hesitating because I'm like, I wonder if I should turn the lights off. I might try that for the next one. Okay, so this being the sternum has 3 parts to it. The manubrium is the upper little part, like the tie, the knot of a tie. And then there's the body. And then at the very bottom, this region here where my thumb is, this region here on this guy is, not the nubbin, I think that's what I call it, the xiphoid process. So I have manubrium, body, xiphoid process. Okay, manubrium, body, xiphoid process at the bottom. And these are anterior to your ribs. And you have 12 pairs of ribs. The first 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, are true ribs. These connect to the sternum via cartilage. This is called costal cartilage. So the first 7 are true. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Which leaves me 5 other pairs of ribs, right? Because you have 12 pairs of ribs, not 12 ribs. You have 24. And the remaining 5 are false ribs, because false ribs don't really connect to the sternum. They just connect to cartilage. And of the false ribs, these last 2 are floating. So floating doesn't mean they don't connect to anything. They connect to the vertebrae in the back, so that's not what floating means at all. But floating means they don't connect to any cartilage in the anterior section of this skeleton. So I have true ribs, false ribs. Of the false ribs, the last 2 floating. Okay, so when I ask you, hey, what category of rib is this? True rib or a false rib? If you want to be fancy, if I'm pointing to one of the lower ones, you could say floating rib. All right, costal cartilage, this is hyaline cartilage. We've learned about hyaline cartilage in the last chapter. The cartilage that you have between the in between the vertebrae, that is called the intervertebral disc. Arms in the way, but I guess we'll just do it this. And this is fibrocartilage. Okay, so fibrocartilage makes up your cartilage disc, your intervertebral discs here. Right, if somebody slipped a disc or there's some sort of swelling or it's shifted, that is this fibrocartilage cushion that has gotten out of whack. Okay, I think that is it for the axial skeleton. It's the skull and all the bones of the skull. And don't forget the 2 on the inside. It's the thoracic cage here, the sternum, the parts of the sternum, the vertebrae, the different regions of the vertebrae, the different curvatures, normal and abnormal. I think we're good. And then, right, why the vertebrae actually look so different. Cervical vertebrae, not weight-bearing versus lumbar, clunky. Everything clunky is weight-bearing. So that's it, guys. It's awkward, but it's how I like to do bones. So I will see you for the next one.